Welcome back to IGN's History of Awesome, a year-by-year breakdown of big events that shape pop culture. In 1992, video games were starting to become more violent, with games like Mortal Kombat and Wolfenstein 3D. Nintendo was expanding the Mario brand with Super Mario Kart and delivering what some believe to be the best Zelda ever. Wayne's World made the jump from Saturday Night Live to the big screen, and reality TV changed forever with the real world. It's time to talk all about 1992.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to History of Awesome. I'm Steve Butts. I'm joined with three of my most awesome people, Naomi Kyle, Zach Ryan, and Jared Petty. We are here to talk about 1992. I am amazed every time we do the prep for one of these how much I took for granted how awesome it was to be alive and experience this stuff. We've got a lot of great things in this year. We've got Mortal Kombat, Zelda, The Real World, Batman the Animated Series. Yeah. But I want to kick it off with one of my favorite all-time games and probably one of the industry's most important games, Wolfenstein 3D.
Yeah, Wolfenstein kind of changed history forever. Wolfenstein changed our expectations of what a computer could do. Before this, computer games were mostly strategy games. They were kind of clunky and choppy, powerful and sophisticated, but we'd never seen anything like this. And then it comes along and they program the sucker and boom, you are flying in 3D space on a computer with no dedicated 3D hardware. Yeah. And it's such a convincing illusion. It's so colorful. It's beautiful. You're in these vast areas. You're exploring in the dark, going from place to place. You're fighting freaking Nazis, gunning away. There's blood flying everywhere. Did you guys play a lot of Wolfenstein?
I did.
I've seen gameplay.
Yeah, I didn't play a ton of Wolfenstein. I was more of a Doom kid.
Oh, you were a Doom kid. Now, Doom comes along. Wolfenstein definitely contributed to the success of Doom. I think some of that success came from the shareware model that Wolfenstein really helped popularize.
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially the early 90s version of a game demo. They released a couple of levels for free and just distributed them, let you copy them. They encouraged you to copy them and share them with your friends. And the idea was, if you like those first few levels, you'll pay full price for the whole deal.
Right, and this is on floppy disks. I mean, there's no...
Yeah. Do you remember how many disks it shipped on?
Actually, the original Wolfenstein you could get on one shareware disk, which is just pretty incredible. Yeah, that's what... I mean, they're very efficient coders. We've learned that over the years. And in addition to making the PC do things it was never meant to do, they created a game that could have a significant chunk. I think it was 10 levels, easily distributed on a disk. That was 9 levels, and they went ahead and put an entire huge hidden stage in the demo while they were at it, just because that was cool. Yeah. And so they give this thing away, and yeah, you would share this out with your friends, and then you actually had to either call a telephone number that was on the disc or in the game, or you had to write and put like a check in an envelope and mail it off and wait for weeks, and Wolfenstein would come back. But it was so compelling that enough people did that they were able to go on and break out and do Doom. Yeah. And that's pretty fantastic. What about what about the original Castle Wolfenstein? Steve, did you ever play that?
I did play that, but Wolfenstein 3D was where it came alive for me. I mean, like you were saying, like the smoothness of it, like it felt so seamless. Just everything in that game just worked and fit together so well, and they weren't at all shy about like the Nazi stuff. Like everything was super bloody, and there's Mecha Hitler, and there's iron crosses and swastikas everywhere, and just like, we don't care, this is what you want to play. And like, I feel like I have killed probably more Nazis as a gamer than were killed in the entire real world.
Undoubtedly.
And it all began there for me.
Yeah, well, they carried that out. Steven Spielberg has used Nazis in how many movies? Because they're easy enemies to easy enemies to hate. Everybody hates Nazis, and you just blast away with a submachine gun, and they would explode in blood and gore. And this is a year that's kind of associated with blood and gore in gaming. Yeah. And even though there were more visceral, experiences with ripping out bodily organs and something like Mortal Kombat that year, I think that in a way, Wolfenstein was actually more intense because you were seeing out of your own eyes, and you hadn't done that much in games before. There had been choppy attempts at 3D, but nothing like this. Wolfenstein didn't just surpass PC expectations, it also was one of the very first computer games to be as fast or faster than what you play on a console. And again, it was a non-linear experience. You were going back and forth, you were exploring and finding. That goes back to the original Wolfenstein game, which was actually an old Apple game. And in that game, you had kind of a fog of war effect. It was an arcade action exploratory game, and they wanted to recreate that in 3 dimensions. The guys, Carmack and Romero, had grown up playing this thing, and they loved it. And they actually got the blessing of the dude that made Wolfenstein. After they finished it, they showed it to him. They didn't ask before, but afterward, they were so proud. They're like, "Look what we did with your idea!" And they ran into it.
Bold move.
And he loved it. He was so positive, so supportive to them. But Wolfenstein, even though it wasn't played by nearly as many people as Doom, it laid the seeds for the success that Doom would have. They pioneered a lot of the technology in it.
Well, I think there's like a lot of iconic imagery that comes from Wolfenstein. Not only like a lot of the Nazi symbology that's there in the game, but also like you mentioned Mecha Hitler, and that's one of the most video gamey images that you can possibly like. That ridiculous Hitler face in that mech is something that like. I don't know. I feel like it's almost synonymous with Wolfenstein.
No, if you think about there's health kits, there's secret doors, there's the character's bloody portrait as he gets damaged. There's so many things that are
going from room to room. I mean, it's iconic of so many games that followed afterwards.
Yeah, backtracking.
GoldenEye.
Backtracking.
Exactly. It laid that pattern for you. Also stabbing German shepherds in the face, very important. But this is, there is a lot of backtracking and exploring. They gave you incentives to explore. You had weapon upgrades hidden behind walls. You had, I mean, like I said, entire hidden areas of the game that you didn't have to see at all, but you could. They just threw this kind of bonus content in because they wanted you to explore, and the exploring was fun. You know, a year later we would get Myst, and Myst would be about exploring in a very different way and a slow, methodical.
There's no Mecha Hitler.
Yeah, and I can't think of like two polar opposite ways to explore a game. Like,
this game incentivized exploring by making it fast, fun, exciting, dangerous. It was very easy to die in Wolfenstein. It's a hard game. And one of the things I really enjoy about it is that it didn't pull any punches in challenge, in carnage, and it was delightfully immature. I think it was Carmack who eventually said that your average video game needs about as much plot as your average porno. I think Wolfenstein really embodies that design philosophy. And it went on to spawn the first-person shooter genre. And for that matter, it also deeply influenced, you know, along with things like Ultima Underworld, what we would eventually get out of the RPGs we play today. A lot of the first-person RPG games have become much more like shooters than they were like the early first-person RPGs. We expect that kind of immersive smoothness. It's also a colorful game, and man, that sound engineering too. Every time you come around the corner, supported your sound card, gave you a reason to have speakers plugged into your PC, and you got guys screaming at you in German. Exactly, you remember that?
The SS guard screaming "Mein Leben" is one of the most iconic cues from a game that I remember. But you also heard Hitler like walking. Like there was one of those games where you could hide and you heard footsteps of characters, and like that was relevant.
As a matter of fact, you kind of had to hide if you were going to beat him. I mean, you couldn't just stand toe to toe. You were done for. I mean, it's a freaking giant robotic Hitler. When you face giant robotic Hitler, you hide first and shoot from behind.
Have you played the game recently?
Wolfenstein? Yeah, actually, I go back to it every now and then. You can still get the sucker running.
That's awesome.
It's a game that I.
How does it hold up? I'm curious.
Oh, it's still fun. Again, you don't have to worry about a vertical axis, and when you don't have to do that, you can really focus your attention on kind of the slide and glide shooting, and they did that really well. Circle strafing makes it easier because we hadn't figured that out back then, and now it's easier to do that. But honestly, I have as much fun playing that as I did Advanced Warfare.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a really good game.
Well, this guy back here, Batman, he's coming up a lot in our history of awesome. This may be my favorite year for him, though, because this is the year that we got Batman the Animated Series. Bruce Timm and Paul Dini, working with Warner, made a cartoon that I feel like is the best representation of Batman across any medium. Yeah. And also introduced Harley Quinn.
Harley Quinn. Harleen Quinzel, her first introduction was in this episode called Joker's Favor. And I don't know what it was about her that people loved, but it was just that she was this crazy, she was, you know, Joker's first henchwoman. And she was obsessed with the Joker, and she was another like Joker incarnation. And I just remember loving that show because it was super dark. And it was enjoyed by adults and kids alike, and it really pulled from all the best parts of Batman, from the 1960s show to the Tim Burton films, you know, and it had the Art Deco Gotham City that was just so cool. And you were talking a lot about the artwork when we were planning this, but yeah, the artwork sketched on dark plats, or what were they called? They
well, yeah, instead of drawing on white, which is usually the standard, they drew on
black. And then just added the bright colors later on, and so it created this really cool ambiance. They had amazing lighting effects, and you can just tell in the first, you know, even the opening of that show how amazing the design was.
And that theme and that opening is very time and place for me. Like anytime that I hear that theme, I can see the animation that goes along with it.
And the music from that show is something that's kind of carried over throughout all the Batman media that followed.
They use that intro to pitch the series. Like that title sequence pitches the series.
It really,
and that's what convinced folks to invest in this. And as a viewer, like you're immediately in there. You know who Batman is, you know what's at stake, and you know kind of like what you're getting into. and it never fails to get me excited.
Oh, that flash of lightning, that last brilliant flash where you see him for just a second.
Just standing on the building.
I love something you said. You pointed out the fact that they drew on dark paper and then used bright colors. This is a show that, despite being, we said it was a dark series, but it's not dark the way like Daredevil is. Right. It's visually dark, but then it's full of color. It's also full of melancholy and occasionally sweetness. You mentioned, Harley Quinn comes along. She's not the kind of sexualized Harley Quinn that we see more and more now. She's kind of a hopeless romantic. She's in a way, in her own perverse way, she's kind of a sweet character.
She's in love with Joker, but he won't give her the time of day.
That kind of tragic sentimentality, I think, is really embodied in the way they treated Mr. Freeze as well, who was sort of this B-list character, kind of a throwaway in the comics.
His whole history was retconned for the animated series, and that's become his canon moving forward. And I love his story, the way that they set him up with his wife Nora, and his episodes in particular are beautiful, amazing episodes.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, the villains were great, but we have to emphasize the voice acting. Michael Ansara did Mr. Freeze. We know Mark Hamill did the Joker and has done him ever since. Yeah. Kevin Conroy, there's no other Batman in my mind.
And he took a cue from Michael Keaton in the Batman movie to have a slightly different voice for each character.
Yep.
But I think he did it better than anybody else.
And he did it all on his own. It actually wasn't something that the casting directors or the directors were like, I want you to sound like this. He really came up with it on his own through Batman's backstory, which is just perfect. It's how we want Batman to be.
Right around this time in my youth, I was getting to the age that I thought I was too big for cartoons. So when I wanted to watch cartoons, I would pretend my little brother was watching. So I wasn't watching cartoons. I was watching my little brother.
Sure.
When Batman came along, I stopped pretending. I had to get home and see every new episode of this wonderful thing.
And the storytelling was so good.
Was the time he got away, the thing where they're all sitting around playing poker? Do you remember they're talking about, or the time I almost got him, pardon me, the time they're talking about each supervillain talking about the time they almost got Batman between each commercial break, and at the end, he's Clayface, and he's been sitting there the whole time listening. It's the most Batman moment. I just love it. It's everything you love about that character played out with humor and intelligence, and that show his characters. It did not talk down to children. It treated us like we had brains in our heads, and also understood that we wanted to see Batman be awesome. And it did both those things really well.
One of my all-time favorite shows. 1992 also benefited greatly for gamers by the appearance of Mortal Kombat. Like the very first time that series arrives, 1992. And I remember being a gamer at that time, and it's in the arcades, and there are just crowds around those machines, and then suddenly games are on the news, and there are people talking about violence and the controversy of what games are doing to kids, and it's like all the issues that we deal with today, the same narrative is still being played out today. Many years later. For me, I love that Mortal Kombat kind of sits at the center of this controversy because the game itself is just super fun. It makes no apologies for that.
I mean, to this day, even Mortal Kombat X or Mortal Kombat 10, I guess, is it's still, people look at it and say, how could this be possible? And it's so ridiculously over the top and violent, and that it saw its genesis right here in 1992. So.
And it's the title it was going up against is Street Fighter 2, a very different game in terms of tone, or at least in terms of presentation, because it's got this sort of cartoony aesthetic. But Mortal Kombat had these digitized real life actors,
real actors, except for Goro.
We look back now. You talk about Mortal Kombat X, and we look back and think, oh, this digitized game looked kind of corny, but then it did not. We're just like, wow, how'd they do that? That's kind of neat. And then blood popping out of them. And there was one in a Rose's discount store in my town, and I would go play it there. It was the only place in town that had it for a while. And I'd go there and play it, and the first time somebody ripped my spine out standing there, because people just crowd around in the Roses and play Mortal Kombat. They would go to the store just to stand there and play this machine. And I was just like, holy, I felt like I was doing something I shouldn't be. And then I pumped another quarter in immediately. It was shocking, and it was shocking in a way that now is almost quaint. But it wasn't quaint for Congress.
Your dad had one where he worked, right?
Yeah, so my dad, all through my childhood, worked at a liquor store, a gas station. He was the manager there, and they had 2 ever-rotating arcade cabinets in the back of the store. And I remember when Mortal Kombat came out, he came home one day and he was telling my mom and I, he was like, we got this game in the store where you fight people and you rip their heads off and rip their guts out and stuff. And my mom was like, that's disgusting, that's terrible. My dad was like, no, it's awesome. and we would play together. I'd go in there after school and play Mortal Kombat against my dad, and it was amazing. And I think
it stayed there for a long time.
Yeah, it did. It did stay there for super long. That was one of the cabinets that ended up not getting rotated out. And I think, to speak to your point, I think the digitized characters added so much more of a visceral feel to that game.
Yeah.
You know.
It's also a game of with a strange kind of substance. The fighting in the original Mortal Kombat is weird. It's really not all that good. You compare it to Street Fighter 2, and it's just so much smoother when you're playing Street Fighter. Mortal Kombat's
well,
not.
The characters are kind of
friendly.
samey in Mortal Kombat. I mean, there are some slight differences, but what distinguishes them are the fatalities.
But exactly. And there's your substance. Your fatalities. Those are fantastic. There's also secrets. You have there's a way to go find a secret character, which was a really neat thing for an arcade game. That was a very console idea, making its way into arcades. They found all kinds of little things to stick in there, neat little secrets, and the fatalities themselves had an aura of mystique about them because they weren't immediately apparent.
Well, the problem with the fatalities was that you only got a chance to practice them if you won the fight, right? So it wasn't like something like firing off a fireball in Street Fighter or whatever. Like you had to get to a moment and it was do or die, and if you didn't do it, great, you maybe weren't going to get there again for another few minutes. But you mentioned Congress and Washington getting involved. I mean, this was the game at the heart of this video game violence debate. And Joseph Lieberman and some of the other folks said, video game industry, like, you've got to clean up your act or we're going to do it for you. And this was the game that caused the industry to create the ESRB. We have that today because of Mortal Kombat. Yeah.
You can actually go back. C-SPAN has those hearings on their website, and you can go back and watch them. They're archived there, and it is high comedy. It really is. The stakes were very high. I mean, it was a situation where, because it wasn't just about protecting the children. It was about politicians finding an easy target. It was about Nintendo and Sega finding ways to go at each other in a public forum, and Nintendo throwing the rest of the video game industry under the bus.
Because Nintendo backed off from the violence in the game. You got punched, and what came out?
Like green. Nintendo called it sweat.
Yeah. Right. And whereupon Sega gave us the ABAC-ABB code, which enabled blood in the Genesis version. But Nintendo was also kind of like, look over there at them, they're evil. We are protecting your children. Yeah. You know, it was really kind of ridiculous.
How much do you think the game benefited from the controversy around it, just in terms of marketing?
I mean, I don't think you can understate how much it benefited.
Yeah.
Like, that game might not have had even a tenth of the impact that it would have if it hadn't been on this national stage. I think putting it in the limelight in that regard, you know, it's kind of, once something is off limits, you want it so much more. And I think that definitely worked in Mortal Kombat's favor. So.
Absolutely. There have been gross video games before this. But this was the one that everybody paid attention to, and that's what
Joseph Lieberman.
You know, and we couldn't get enough of it. I remember having more than one all-night, overnight sleepover party where we just sat and played Mortal Kombat till the sun came up.
Well, and it came out for everything. I mean, if you owned a video game platform, odds were within a couple of years you had Mortal Kombat on it.
Yeah, certainly.
Well, let's move on. There was a special Valentine's gift for people in this year as well. Mike Myers' Wayne's World movie came out, right? Like the ultimate date movie. I can't think of a better date
Party
movie.
time, excellent.
Swing.
Yeah. Wayne's World is a seminal film to my childhood. It came out, I mean, I was young when Wayne's World came out. 92, I was 7, 8 years old. So I remember watching it and thinking as a kid, like, oh, wow, being a teenager is going to be awesome. Like, not that those guys were teenagers, but to me, like, that's what that was. And it's funny to watch it now because it's such a beautiful sort of slice of life film. And it really, I think it really characterized what suburban life was like in the early 90s.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah,
it's like a cartoon version of it.
It is a cartoon version of growing up in flyover country at a time when that was an increasingly alienating experience. And I think it does capture that, because there's a sweetness to Wayne's World. Yeah, it's goofy, and there's also that wonderful surrealism. You have Dreamweaver cut in when he sees the girl in the streets, or
Foxy Lady
dance
or breaking the fourth wall, all the way up, the multiple endings, you know, on and on. But in the midst of that, there is a kind of a grounded realism that's paying off, and it's that these are very believable human beings. I knew Waynes and Garths.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
And I think
I still know Waynes and Garths.
I might have been a Garth, come to think of it.
It's a really nice window into sort of the public access culture of the time.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, like, TV stations used to set aside some programming time or some programming space for people to just come on and do their own thing. And it's very much kind of like the YouTube culture of today, but on broadcast television.
Right.
And it was really interesting to see that be sort of the central kind of conceit of that character. Which I think was amazing.
I might have had a public access television show.
Oh, undoubtedly, Jared.
That might have happened.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about what this movie did for the song Bohemian Rhapsody, right?
Well, it
it's
revived
a great song.
Queen. All of a sudden, people were buying Queen cassette tapes again, and it actually brought people who grew up in the '80s or who love classic rock to love this movie as well. Like my dad would have never watched a movie like this, but because it had Queen in it or because it had Jimi Hendrix, he wanted to watch it, and it was a great mesh of the 80s and 90s. I mean, if you look at Mike Myers' style with the ripped jeans and the plaid shirt tied around his waist, it was totally emulant of Kurt Cobain style or Guns N' Roses, so it was really kind of a cool, it represented the early 90s in a really great way, I think.
I think the catchphrases and sort of the slogans from that movie caught on, but if you remember only one thing when you see that movie, it's that scene in the car where they're singing Bohemian Rhapsody.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. It's iconic.
It's the reason why I know that song word for word to this day. I mean,
I didn't know Bohemian Rhapsody until
you saw that movie.
And you had a cable access show?
I know.
It seems weird.
Yeah. Also, not from the show notes, but also responsible for a great roller coaster at Carowinds in North Carolina. The Hurler.
Weird. Really?
Yeah, the Hurler.
I need to try that now.
I will say the one thing I don't like about Wayne's World, or maybe I can pitch this as a compliment, Wayne's World is the best of the SNL skit movies.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
There's a whole decade of these immediately after this. There's Pat and Stewart and the Coneheads and all these others, but Wayne's World was, discounting Blues Brothers, which was 12 years earlier.
Also
Wayne's World is the best of all of the entire
and the
batch.
highest grossing of the SNL movies.
Yeah.
Just fun fact.
Well, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the real world. There was reality TV before MTV.
It was always real.
Produced the Real World, but the Real World for me, and I think for most of us, set the model.
Yeah, it paved the way for reality TV, what we know reality TV to be today.
It's interesting because MTV wanted originally to commission a soap opera. They wanted like a Melrose Place or a 90210.
That's right, scripted media.
And it just didn't work, and they thought, you know what, it's a lot cheaper if we don't have to hire actors and writers and makeup people. Let's just pay these students, basically, these kids, $2,500 for a season, and rent a house, and maybe send them on a vacation, and like that's the cost of production. You know, minus the camera crew and the editing. And one thing that I think made it work is it hit this really interesting intersection of video, right? Like where you don't have to use film now to produce stuff, and digital workstations, right? You could use Avid technology now to basically edit 18 hours of footage down into a 22-minute episode without a lot of extra steps that were required if you were using film.
And at that convergence, you create an entirely new kind of television. And the thing, I'm not a big fan of reality TV now. I think it's done things to damage dramatic storytelling on television. But back then, this was awesome. And it was awesome because we were all fooled. We, for the most part, believed these people were actually living out these lives. And they were not what we call today reality stars. People go into reality TV now to have careers in reality TV.
And that was the point that I was going to make, is like the early seasons of The Real World are, for the most part, an almost sort of honest look at youth culture at that time.
Yeah, social
because people hadn't learned to ham it up for reality TV. There was no such thing as going on a reality TV show to create a career, like you're saying. Like this was something of an experiment, and so it's really interesting to take a look at those early seasons and just see the way that people behaved on reality TV then, as opposed to the way they do now.
Absolutely.
One of the great things I think it did is it brought to light a lot of taboo subjects that weren't covered in other media or as predominantly as it did in this show. I mean, it hit home because, I mean, these were people with real issues, drug addiction, I mean, AIDS, things that weren't being talked about really publicly, and this show was so popular. It was like the Game of Thrones of that time. It was huge for that, and it brought to light a lot of interesting and subjects that needed to be talked about.
Yeah, and we did talk about it. It became water cooler television. You went to school and you talked about what happened on The Real World the night before. You went to work and you talked about what happened on The Real World the night before. And it was engaging and fascinating and hypnotic. And we haven't talked about it. It touched on that sense of voyeurism that exists inside of both of us in kind of a weird little way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think in kind of a weird little way. I mean, that's just blatant. Like, it's voyeurism in the strictest sense.
Well, it's part of it. I think that was the appeal of like Cops and People's Court and some of the shows that preceded this. But I think you make a great point about like the sort of youthful nature of the cast and like the taboo subjects that they touched on. And what's interesting is in other countries, when they've produced series like this, where there's a much more rigid cast structure, it's actually done a lot to break down biases or prejudices, or at least force people to confront those questions in a way that they hadn't before. and when tied into some sort of voting mechanic like there is on American Idol, like really brought to some of these countries a real sense of democracy for the first time. I know in a very limited sense, but like all that comes from Real World.
Yeah,
like, all that comes from
Real World popularized the format, and everything from that point on is reality TV, like what we see today. You know, the Duck Dynasties and the Kardashians, but now it's a lot more manufactured. You know, back then it was just, it's what popularized the format.
I think there'll always be a debate about how real the Real World is, but I imagine it was a lot less artificial.
I think it was a lot less artificial. I mean, from my personal opinion.
Well, one of my first gigs in video, I interned for a guy who was a shooter on the Real World San Francisco, which I think we decided was season 2 or 3.
That was season 3, I think. That was 94 with Pedro and
right.
Puck.
And he said that even at that point, that it was mostly, there was no real reshooting. It was mostly unscripted, which is something that has obviously
changed a lot.
Not the case in subsequent seasons.
I almost wonder if you could get away with making the marketing angle on a new reality show. Hey, the reality show that's actually real. And make it work.
Nobody wants to watch that because it's boring now.
Well,
the thing is, you'd even have to walk that back on the Real World, though, because these are kids who are 18 to 25 years old who are getting paid money to live in a house that they didn't pay for and get sent on vacation. So even if the producers aren't prompting them for drama or conflict, like it's still a little bit unrelatable. But I think in that way, it made it sort of aspirational for the MTV generation. Like they thought, oh, that's really cool. I wish my life was like that. And there was usually somebody on the show that you could relate to. I mean, they were so diverse just in terms of their casting, and they had people of very different religious beliefs or political attitudes, and obviously different races and different regional backgrounds.
I filled out a Real World application once.
Did you really?
I did.
I
learned a lot about Jared Petty on this episode.
learning a lot.
I would have liked to have seen that.
You never will.
Yeah. Would it basically have been you just playing Super Mario Kart?
Yeah, probably so. As a matter of fact, yes, which was sort of what happened that year anyway. Right. But nice segue there. But no,
don't call attention to it. Now it's awkward. But no, Super Mario Kart also came out in 1992, and I think for me, the battle mode is what made that game for me. But the races were still incredibly fun.
They really were.
Incredibly hard.
Yeah,
they were. You get up to the high CCs on Rainbow Road, and it's still challenging, even in that original game. You got battle mode. Battle mode! It was deathmatch. It was smooth deathmatch on a single TV, which was really hard to pull off. Yeah. I mean, we talked about, again, the term hadn't even been invented yet. That would be a year later. But it was a way to fight your friends. Yeah, battle mode was amazing. But I think what makes Mario Kart's the real lasting impact that it had is the fact that this was where Mario transcended the platformer.
Sure.
Super Mario has become so much a part of our enduring culture that forgetting about the possibility that he might just have been something that we associate with the 80s and 90s. Mario Kart, I believe, is the reason that he has moved beyond that and will be with us forever. Because in Mario Kart, he stepped out of the genre we associated with him and very successfully came into another world, brought his friends with him, did something new, and that laid the groundwork for Mario Party. And for the Mario Sports games, and Mario RPG, and Super
by
Paper
extension,
Mario.
Luigi's games as well.
Exactly, Luigi's Mansion, or Captain Toad, or because these characters, or for that matter, the sudden reappearance of Donkey Kong after his long absence from the Nintendo library. These characters became, we'd seen that in Super Mario 2. To a degree, but we didn't have personalities. Now each racer had his own statistics, his own feel, or her own feel in the case of the princess, and we became engaged with them in ways that we hadn't before, and it worked so well.
You had your own favorite. I mean, it was inevitable, right?
Yeah, who was yours? Who'd you play?
Princess Peach.
I was Yoshi. Anybody who picks something different is just objectively wrong.
Okay.
Oh,
I play as Yoshi now, but on Super NES I played as Luigi.
I was a Toad guy because I'm no good at the game. And that continues a trend that I am 12th out of 12 to this day.
We were talking about Super Mario Kart yesterday, and that is a tough game.
Yeah.
I mean, it's especially if you play the newer games and then go back to Super Mario Kart, because you basically have to retrain your fingers how to work on that game. Like it's tough.
And it's the fact they were able to pull it off is a technical marvel.
Sure.
I mean, it's really fooling you. You've got that Mode 7 effect going on under the track. The SNES could not really natively do 3D. You had to do this. You had the Super FX chip for Star Fox, but that was on the cartridge.
Right.
So they figured out a way to use the SNES hardware to fool us. And it's a really cool example of Nintendo doing something they do, I think, more often than we give them credit for, taking a genre or a type of game that they're not necessarily well known for or comfortable with and doing their own take on it, building what's fun out of that. They took, in this case, racing games at that period of time were becoming more and more and more realistic as technology.
More simulators,
Nintendo went absolutely the other way with both of their SNES racing franchises, F-Zero, which is in space, and Mario Kart, which is kind of a slow, weapon-based, cartoony, super accessible thing, and it opened up that kind of game to a whole new world. Nintendo does that really well. You look at games like Earthbound, their take on the RPG. And some of that is them engaging new genres. Some of that, I think, also they don't get enough credit for, is they'll start with an idea internally, and they'll build out, and at the end, it'll kind of look like another genre, but you take it, what we got with Splatoon, you know, the tofu becoming the squid thing. Sometimes it's just what's fun. And,
Awesome. I want to talk just real briefly about a couple of big comic stories from this year as well. Obviously, Batman the Animated Series is, for comic fans, one of the highlights. But this was also the year that Image Comics was founded. So Marvel had always sort of had this tension with its creators because they owned everything that their creators made. And three of their top talents, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld, said, we don't like that anymore. We want to go make our own imprint. And they formed Image Comics and began producing their own comics, and Spawn was obviously one of the big ones, but they invited other artists to participate and spawned DC to create its own imprint, Vertigo, and created the, led to the creation of Dark Horse Comics. So really a seminal moment. But the bigger story for comics that year was the death of Superman. In Superman 75, Superman dies. He's killed by Doomsday. Spoilers if you haven't finished it yet.
Spoilers for the death of Superman?
But yeah, I mean, this was a big event.
23-year-old spoilers.
Presaged in Crisis on Infinite Earths. You know, DC kind of rebooted everything, and they created this very public campaign where they said they were going to kill Superman. And it ran across the 4 Superman comics that were active at that time, and he was killed by Doomsday. And the thing that struck me about it was here were comics being talked about on the news, and I'd just never seen that before.
Yeah, that's something that really stuck with me. The death of Superman being covered on the nightly news was something that blew my childhood mind. Like, I couldn't figure out, I guess when you're a kid you don't realize how big a character is because he means something to you, but to turn on the TV and see the news talking about the death of Superman and interviewing people, you know, like, that was really impactful for me because, like, oh wow, there's a lot of people that care about this.
Well, it speaks to the enduring nature of the character, and you know, it was a marketing ploy.
Certainly,
they made no secret of that. But it was a marketing ploy because people were starting to have, some people had the perception that the character was boring or that he was losing some interest. That news coverage was a reminder to us that there were aspects of Superman's character that we may have forgotten about, and it actually served ultimately to bring him back into the limelight. And that's why I think that even though it's the death of a beloved character, it led to something very awesome. It reminded us that Superman is in fact engaging and compelling and Earth's mightiest hero.
What's funny is that was a backup plan for them because they wanted to marry him to Lois Lane. But the folks at Lois and Clark were also writing that story, and they said, can we please not do this at the same time? And they gave the wedding to Lois and Clark, and they said, what the hell are we going to do? And somebody jokingly said, I don't know, let's just kill him. And they made the story out of it.
And then they went with it.
But as you said, there was a backlash. Like, he was alive less than a year later, so a lot of people who had been brought into comic book reading were super frustrated by that, and it was part of the '90s speculator bust.
Where came back with that stupid blue suit.
People
well,
bought
before
this
that,
comic.
you had Reign of the Supermen. Even before that, you know,
people bought this comic up by the truckload, and I just checked on eBay, and you can buy it for like $20. Right. So, that's a bad story for the comic industry, but definitely something that was hugely influential in the year. Last thing I want to touch on here, one of the biggest things of the year, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, comes out here in the U.S. on April 13th.
It certainly does.
Huge.
Yeah, and this is probably one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. I've played A Link to the Past more times than I care to admit, but yeah, it is a masterpiece. And I think the thing about Link to the Past that's really fascinating to me, it's directed by the same guy that directed the original Legend of Zelda. And we saw this a lot on the Super NES, where it's almost a do-over of the NES version of that game, right? So The Legend of Zelda was this sprawling open world, for the time, adventure, and they did something a little different with Zelda 2 that, you know, saw some backlash. And so they went back to their roots with this game, and it became this huge success. It's one of the highest grossing SNES games of all time. And for good reason. I think it's an incredible game, artistically, gameplay-wise. just across the board. Yeah, the music is amazing.
Is so
the
iconic.
sound engineering is amazing. That SNES sound chip was really powerful, and they found so many great ways to use it. It really just there's so many like recognizable little jingles that come out of it that
right from the get-go, and then all throughout the game.
Well, it's the title that really introduced us to a lot of the mainstay Zelda themes. You know, you've got Kakariko Village, Zelda's Lullaby, like those all make their first appearance.
The Master Sword.
The Master
Sword starts there. You also have the Principle of the Two Worlds brought in that's become so much a part of the series. You also, this is the first Zelda, I think, that was really heavily engaged in puzzle solving in the dungeons. I think that Zelda 1 had a little of it, Zelda 2 had a little of it, but the Link to the Past is just absolutely crammed with puzzle dungeons, and it works so well.
One some of the greatest boss fights of all time, too. A couple of those bosses, like, to this day, are still my favorite.
And some of the puzzles, interestingly to me, relied on that light-dark world shift, right? Like there were parts of the solution in each area. You had to really piece that together, and to me, that was really engaging. I thought this game's really complex and is like it's not just fun to play because you can swing a sword and like beat up bushes, but like you really have to think about how you get through each section.
And it's a reminder to us. Nintendo popularized Tetris, but ironically, in the process, they kind of drove. We changed the idea of what we thought of as puzzle games. Before Tetris, puzzle games were load runner. Running around and solving a level in an arcade stage. Then everything was blocks. Zelda took us back and reminded us, no, wait a minute, there's a whole other way to go about this, and a way that, frankly, I think I enjoy much more. It is a masterpiece of. It's also, again, restrained. It's not overly chatty. The story makes itself apparent in very engaging and organic ways as you're playing through it. You figure out what's happening quickly. It's whimsical. It's a wonderful piece of engineering and design.
I mean, we mentioned the themes, the parallel worlds, the Master Sword. Like, what do you think the lasting legacy of Zelda is today? Because there haven't been a lot of imitators. Like Nintendo keeps doubling down on Zelda, but like nobody else really seems to be able to capture that magic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line is just you can feel the love that went into that game when you play A Link to the Past. It's such a thoughtfully created world. And even on repeat plays, it never really gets old. It's something that sort of stands the test. Not sort of. I mean, I don't even know how I would say that. It completely stands the test of time.
Yeah,
and
I mean, they based A Link Between Worlds on it, so
well,
I mean,
and it's a game that I will be excited to show my kids. I will proudly put this in front of them and say this is one of the greatest games of all time.
It's a 3-year-old child.
Before you play anything else, you have to play
this game.
I also think it's inspired certain games, but not necessarily imitators. I think it's inspired schools of design. The Witcher 3, frankly, is Zelda with naked people and more talking.
They should put that on the box.
They should definitely use that as a marketing tool.
It's Witcher with naked people and more talking. You look at something like Fable 2, heavily Zelda inspired. But
there's even games that I brought up in pre-production here that I feel like the legacy of the Soul Reaver games are very inspired by Zelda. There's Darksiders, the original Darksiders. You know, there's a lot of these games that try to put their own spin on Zelda, and a lot of them are very successful in doing so. But there's none that really capture that magic and that sense of wonder that you get when you're playing a Zelda game. And none of the Zelda games I feel like really match up to this game.
I agree. I think Nintendo has a whimsy injection machine deep inside their Kyoto campus somewhere, and they just go in and every now and then, and that's what happens. That's my guess.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree. Such an awesome game. There are plenty of other things we'd love to talk about. We just don't have time. This was also the year of Reservoir Dogs, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Alone in the Dark, Dune 2, the X-Men cartoon, which in many ways, for many fans, was just as awesome as the Batman cartoon.
Rogue.
But guys, thank you so much for having an awesome conversation with me about 1992. We want to come back soon with 1993. We're going to be talking about more awesome stuff for that year. There's going to be Doom, there's Jurassic Park, there's the X-Files. So we want to know what you think was awesome in this. So leave your comments below and be sure to check back for more History of Awesome on IGN.